In the last episode, the Edo Bakufu began to falter through a combination of ineffective shoguns, financial struggles, failed reforms, natural disasters, and local rebellions. The atmosphere in Japan was already becoming quite tense, when another situation beyond their shores would only add fuel to the fire. The British victory in the First Opium War sent chills through Bakufu leaders, as modern military technologies of the West were on full display in Britain's triumph against the numerically larger Chinese army. With Western empires pushing their own spheres of influence deeper into Asia, Japan came face to face with a threat they had once sought to shut out. We saw how British, Russian, and American efforts to open relations with Japan began to increase drastically starting in the late 18th century, but even more considerably into the 19th century, causing the Bakufu to implement measures to force foreign vessels away, potentially even violently. Yet, while arguments in Japan continued regarding whether or not Japan should open to the West or stay shut for the sake of continued security, other countries began to realize that if Japan was to be opened, it would have to be done so through force of arms. Now it is at last the hour of reckoning, as American warships under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry will arrive in Japan with an ultimatum that the Bakufu will be unable to refuse. The Bakumatsu is soon to be at hand. By the early 1850s, Japan was at a crossroads. Its long period of isolation from much of the outside world, which we have come to commonly refer to as sakoku, was coming to an end. Now, often the conclusion of this period is portrayed as sudden, the arrival of warships from across the sea, surprising Japan and compelling the nation to open through an unprecedented show of force. Yet, in reality, as we saw through the prior episode, a number of Western nations had for a time already been attempting to pry open the gates to Japan. Measures by the Bakufu to reduce the interference from foreign powers had been steadfast, yet not without challenge, not only through certain international incidents but also through a growing discontent at home, where certain voices had begun to arise, questioning the need to remain shut off to the West. At this time, however, the Bakufu was still in no position to open the country, seeing such a drastic action as potentially catastrophic, especially given what had been transpiring in China. The status quo of safety and stability away from the outside world was far more appealing. Unfortunately, in the end, such a sentiment would prove to be irrelevant. Across the Pacific Ocean, great changes were at hand. The United States, a nation which roughly only 7 decades earlier had won its independence from Britain, was now expanding. Piece by piece, through treaties with other colonial powers and the slow annexation of land belonging to indigenous peoples, the U.S. was approaching the west coast of North America. By 1848, the U.S. would decisively win the Mexican-American War, a conflict fought against another former colonial territory which too had only several decades prior declared its own independence. In the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which brought an end to the war, the United States claimed the former Mexican territories north of the Rio Grande, or Rio Grande, and extending west to California. With a new coastline now ripe for maritime trade, the U.S. looked to foster new relationships with Asian countries across the Pacific. China was the main objective, as the country possessed numerous goods which were the envy of the West. As we know, China had attempted to resist advances by European nations such as Great Britain, leading to retaliation and eventually the disastrous Opium Wars. With China, now in a much weakened state, opposed to the West, the US sought to capitalize off of these developments for their own economic benefit. What remained, however, was the question of Japan. There were several reasons why the US would have wanted Japan to open its borders to the West, perhaps even more so than European nations. Paramount among them was the ability to resupply at Japanese ports. Not only was this seen as necessary for US merchant vessels coming from China, but also for the American whaling industry, which had become quite active in the North Pacific. As mentioned, there had also been prior diplomatic incidents between both nations which had antagonized the US. Under a recently repealed order to dissuade the docking of foreign vessels, Japanese ports were commanded to fire upon any ships that were not from China, Korea, or the Ryukyu Islands. As we had already discussed, this led to situations such as the Morrison incident, where a US merchant vessel was fired upon while trying to return some Japanese castaways back to their homes. Such compounding matters made the opening of Japan a priority for US President Millard Fillmore, who in 1851 authorized a special envoy to Japan with the aims of once again opening relations and securing trade. This mission, however, was different than prior attempts, as instead of coming peacefully and largely unarmed, the new mission would come forcefully, utilizing a strong military presence to intimidate the Japanese. Originally, Commodore John Aulick had been given the task, yet after some problematic situations involving Aulick, he would be replaced by Commodore Matthew Perry in early 1852. Perry was a veteran of the Mexican-American War and an experienced naval officer, having earned distinction during the conflict. He was trusted and competent, and certainly seen as the right man for the job. Perry appears to have already been studying the Japanese situation to some degree. Apparently, he had spent numerous hours at the New York Public Library reading what he could about Japan, learning what the West had tried to understand about a nation they had been largely barred from entering for over 2 centuries. His assessment was that only a proper show of force would get through to the Japanese. Large warships, preferably modern steamships, would be necessary. Although the Japanese had heard of such ships, it is different to encounter them firsthand. Additionally, he believed that Nagasaki should be avoided, given that the Dutch presence there could muddy the situation. Instead, heading straight for Edo was seen as the clear goal. His initial squadron would include 4 warships, 2 of which, the USS Mississippi and the USS Susquehanna, being modern steamships. Perry carried with him a letter for the Japanese Emperor from President Fillmore, along with numerous gifts as well. Although outwardly Perry wanted to project military power, still there needed to be some measure to reassure the Japanese that the ultimate goal was a peaceful and friendly relationship. The Dutch had actually become aware of the US mission sometime earlier and had warned the Bakufu of these potential developments. Overall, the Bakufu kept the information somewhat secret, yet also began to expand security around key locations throughout the country in case the rumors turned out to be true. In late May of 1853, Perry's squadron reached the Ryukyu Islands after having departed from Shanghai. He and some of his officers and crew would spend time on Okinawa, where they were well received by the local government. Perry would hand Okinawan leaders a similar letter to that which he was to present in Japan, urging the islands to open up to American trade. Yet the Okinawans, who were largely under Japanese control, kindly refused. Perry didn't spend too much time fretting over such matters, though, because his primary goal was instead Japan itself. He would depart the islands empty-handed and continue on his voyage northward towards his true aim. On July 8th, Perry's expedition would reach Japan, not making their way entirely into Edo Bay, but instead reaching the precipice. The squadron stopped at Uraga on the Miura Peninsula. With the former fire-on-sight order against foreign vessels having been repealed, Perry's ships remained unmolested as they made their way to the shores. As onlookers, both civilian and samurai, began to crowd around the harbor. As expected, the sight of powerful modern warships was truly shocking to many. The Uraga Bugyo, Tora Ujihide, later wrote, "Two of the American warships were ironclad steamers. One is mounted with 30 or 40 cannons, one with 12. The other two ships with more than 20 cannons each. They can move about freely without the use of scull or oar, and can come and go with great speed. They are just like floating castles, which can move about as they please." Unlike his arrival in the Ryukyu Islands, Perry chose to initially stay aboard his vessel, prompting Uraga officials, accompanied by a Dutch interpreter, to come aboard the American flagship, Susquehanna, in attempts to speak with Perry. The Americans had also brought with them several Japanese castaways for the purposes of translation, thus there were no communication barriers between the two. Despite this, Perry was playing an intricate game of showcasing his own power in the situation. He refused to speak with any Japanese official of lower rank than what would be equivalent to himself, but eventually consented to allowing one of his subordinate officers, a certain Lieutenant Conti, to speak with the Japanese anyway. One of the first orders of business was the removal of Japanese guard boats surrounding the American warships, being that the Americans threatened to retaliate if the Japanese continued to hound them. The Japanese agreed and the boats were dispersed. On the following day, another meeting was held in which the Japanese attempted to gain further knowledge regarding the expedition itself, details such as the names of the ships and number of crew aboard, yet many of these details were not disclosed by the Americans. Throughout these interactions, the Americans were repeatedly asked to instead sail down to Nagasaki so that they could conduct their business there. Yet, as we know, such a thing was out of the question. What Perry desired was the delivery of President Fillmore's letter to the Emperor. Obviously, despite his best efforts to learn about the Japanese, Perry was perhaps still somewhat ignorant to the fact that real authority rested with the Shogun. At least he understood that Edo was the true seat of power. If the letter was not accepted promptly and at this location, Perry indicated that he would consider the United States to be insulted by the Japanese. In the meantime, Perry sent out several of his vessels to begin scouting the surrounding coastline, supposedly noting that the closer his ships neared Edo, the friendlier the Japanese officials became. They obviously understood how deadly these modern warships were and were trying their best to appease the Americans while considering the situation. There was also an exchange of gifts and supplies between the Americans and the Japanese, as both sides upheld the face of goodwill toward one another. Behind the scenes, Bakufu officials were scrambling on what to do. Shogun Tokugawa Ieyoshi had become quite ill and was nearing the end of his life. Bedridden, he largely took no part in the whole ordeal. Instead, his counselor, Abe Masahiro, took charge of the situation. Understanding its severity, he knew that accepting Perry's letter from the American president was something that could not be avoided at this point. He would permit the landing of American forces at Kurihama, just south of Uraga, so that they could finally settle their affairs. On July 14th, 6 days after Perry's initial arrival, he came ashore in force. Historian Christopher Harding described the moment in detail. When Perry stepped ashore near the entrance to Edo Bay, he did so in the company of 100 sailors, 100 Marines, and 2 military bands. Perry marched up the beach with the 2 largest and most threatening-looking men of his squadron by his side, both given extra weapons to wear for the occasion. Hosts far outnumbered the guests. Thousands of samurai were arrayed along the beach and up a nearby hill, on foot and on horseback, armed with swords, spears, and guns. But they struck Perry as a small and effeminate bunch, drawn up in ragged formation with local villagers allowed to gawp through the gaps at their foreign visitors. Perry thought his own men, by contrast, exuded strength and discipline, despite some being kept up the night before by the sound of Japanese carpenters hurriedly constructing a pavilion in which to welcome them. Perry's actual meeting with Japanese officials was somewhat awkward and standoffish. He handed 2 letters over to the Japanese, one from President Fillmore and one written by Perry himself. One story also suggests that Perry handed the Bakufu 2 white flags, with the message that should Japan attempt to resist the United States and seek war, they would need to use the white flags to surrender against the superior American military might. However, this detail has been called into question by historians. Regardless, the Bakufu, cautious as always, requested that a year be granted so that they could take time to consider their options. To this, Perry was willing to agree. Before departing from Japanese waters, Perry made one last show of force by sailing into the bay closer to Edo. It was here that he then instructed his ships to fire blank shots from their cannons. This was supposedly in honor of the United States Independence Day and had been communicated as such to the Bakufu, so there was no worry within the government. Civilians had received warning as well. Nevertheless, many were still caught off guard and began to panic. Chaos briefly gripped Edo, as many for a moment feared they were under attack. However, once it was realized the shots were harmless, people settled down. Following this, the American squadron departed Japan, heading back to a friendly port in China. All things considered, this was obviously a moment of great concern for the Edo Bakufu. Despite their best efforts to avoid dealing with the West, a reckoning had finally come. The imperial court had even gone so far as to order temples and shrines to pray for help in expelling the barbarians from their shores while maintaining safety and security. What of course added to the severity of the situation was the way in which it was clear and obvious the Japanese had fallen behind militarily. Many Bakufu officials, especially those who had personally seen the American warships, which had come to be called Kurofune or Black Ships, and had also seen the American military parade, were acutely aware of Japan's military inferiority. Of course, some Japanese leaders had already understood this even prior to Perry's arrival, given the developments from China in their war against the British. Yet it was a completely different thing to now be facing such technological innovations firsthand. It was a moment of crisis in Japan, as the Bakufu was unsure on how to proceed given this shocking situation. Had Shogun Ieyoshi been well, he might have been able to make the ultimate decision on the matter. Yet he was now on his deathbed and would pass away by late July of that year, which then caused his son, Tokugawa Ieyasu, to later take up the mantle of shogun. In the meantime, the Bakufu was still attempting to chart its own course. It was then that it was decided to do something rather unprecedented. The Bakufu would ask for opinions. First sending out requests to daimyo across the country, then to other prominent samurai in Edo, the Bakufu hoped to find a consensus with which to help them make a reasonable decision. Many of the figures who lent their voices to the conversation were opposed to opening the country and were instead of the opinion that Japan should resist the Americans even if it meant a disastrous war against a technologically superior foreign threat. For many of them, it appears to have been an issue more concerned with pride and not giving in to barbarian demands. Anti-Western sentiment had already been picking up in Japan following the developments in China. The arrival of American warships in Japan, along with their demands, had now caused the situation to explode, as many across the country began to embrace a budding new ideology, which would later evolve into the Sonno Joi movement, which saw those frustrated with the Bakufu call for a renewed reverence to the emperor and the expulsion of all foreign barbarians. Among the most radical was a figure by the name of Sakuma Shozan. Like many at the time, Shozan was staunchly against the West's interference in Japanese affairs. Yet, unlike some of his contemporaries, he also saw great merit in Western theories and technologies. He had spent time studying the West and believed he understood what aspects Japan needed to advance in order to stand on its own confidently. However, he had also studied Chinese texts and was considered a Confucian scholar. He believed the West lacked what could be considered as Eastern morality, and thus his own approach was for Japan to adopt and infuse Western science and technology with such Eastern morals. Shozan had become a very significant figure, having the ear of powerful officials within the Bakufu, as well as amassing a group of prominent disciples, such as Yoshida Shoin, Sakamoto Ryoma, and Katsu Kaishu. Katsu Kaishu, originally known as Katsu Rintaro, is another fascinating figure will come to play a titular role in our story going forward. In 1853, he had been living and working for the Bakufu in Edo, where he had helped establish a school which focused on teaching military strategies learned from the Dutch. Through his work, he had made a number of significant acquaintances and would end up submitting his own opinions to the Bakufu regarding what to do about the American ultimatum. Kaishu agreed with a number of Shozan's theories, yet also felt that Shozan was far too radical in his approach. Thus, when he submitted a powerful letter to the Bakufu of his own thoughts on what to do, he took some of Shozan's better points but fine-tuned them to be more approachable. It was here he advised the Bakufu to adopt many modern military customs and technologies, both on land and at sea, establishing a mighty modern navy to defend Japanese shores and a strong modern army on land. To do this, the Bakufu would of course need to undergo quite drastic changes to current policies and embrace more systems akin to that of a meritocracy, in order to ensure that more men of ability and talent found their way into leadership roles. In sum, Kaishu argued that the only way for Japan to resist the West was to adopt the methods of the West, and in order to accomplish that, significant change was necessary from the ground up. What is quite interesting though during this was indeed the fact that the Bakufu had even asked for opinions in the first place. This was the emergence of a new political theory in Japan called Kogi Seitairon, or the public government system, in which the government sought to gain the consensus of more people in order to make better decisions as a whole. Such efforts would continue on over the coming decades, as a certain number of Bakufu leaders sought to become more open-minded. Now, of the many ideas received by the Bakufu, the ones that argued for continued modernization in one form or another in order to compete with the West were seen as the most ideal. This would eventually prompt the Bakufu to lift prior restrictions on the size of vessels that Japanese domains could build, and even to seek to purchase a number of warships from the Dutch, yet nowhere near as many as they would actually need. Military reform on land was another matter. Figures like Shozan and Kaishu had acquired a better understanding of Western warfare, but without direct aid, their own attempts to introduce modernized military methods and technologies would not be able to achieve their full potential. In truth, however, whatever efforts the Bakufu attempted to implement were really not enough to ever resist the Americans upon Perry's return by February 1854. He had returned earlier than expected, several months shy of being gone for a whole year as was initially believed. What's more is that this time he came with an even larger fleet. Up to 7 American vessels now sailed into Edo Bay. Initially they caused quite a panic, but being that their return was suspected and that they posed no imminent threat, people simply came to look on and wonder, curiosity or uncertainty. Both sides greeted each other more cordially than before, sharing fine cuisine and gifts. Eventually, it was decided that a formal set of meetings between Bakufu officials and the American delegation would begin on March 8th in Yokohama. It was here that Perry came ashore with upwards of 400 American soldiers and sailors. In the meeting, Bakufu officials responded to President Fillmore's letter by agreeing to open a single port for the Americans to resupply their vessels and to accept Japanese castaways. However, they declined any attempt to open trade between the countries. Perry remained stern, only briefly taking trade off the table but demanding the opening of more ports. While Shimoda and Hakodate were decided as 2 ports to be opened, the Japanese attempted to resist American demands to station troops in Shimoda. By March 31st, after weeks of negotiations, the Japanese and Americans would finally sign the famous Treaty of Peace and Amity, bringing a close to what came to be known as the Convention of Kanagawa, opening the 2 previously mentioned ports while not officially beginning trade between the countries. Within the document were a series of 12 articles that solidified a relationship between Japan and the US. They laid out a pact of friendship, the opening of designated ports to American vessels, and matters related to the purchasing of supplies. It was also listed that the United States government may at a later date establish a consul in Shimoda. With this, Japan's age of isolation was brought to an end. Overall, it certainly should not be viewed as a terrible deal for Japan. For the most part, it was a compromise. But a compromise could still be viewed as a severe sign of weakness, especially to those who were staunchly against any deals with the West. And of course, this compromise would only open the door to further pressures from Western powers, as in the years to come, others would seek their own treaties with Japan. Thus, for now, in the immediate aftermath of the ratification of the treaty with the US, the tense atmosphere in the country only continued to worsen. Those who had been strongly opposed to any negotiations with the barbarians only continued to grow resentful of the Bakufu's actions, while others did see this as a moment of progress towards a modern Japan and the country's emergence on the world stage. The divide was certainly deepening, yet nothing could stand in the way of the inevitable, and now it was up to the Bakufu, daimyo, and other prominent leaders and voices across the country to determine what future was in store for Japan. Truly, it was an uncertain time, and the fallout from Perry's arrival and the Bakufu's response has only just begun. In the next episode, Japan is open. As the country begins to treat with the West, groups of agitators at home will begin to form. Heated debates will rise as voices begin to argue about the direction the country is heading in. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most informative.